In this video, I will introduce Aristotle's theory of perception. In the first part of this video, I will present the basic questions Aristotle's theory of perception aims to answer. Perceptual activities involve three things. First, perception. Second, sense organs. Third, objects of perception. For example, when you see a red tomato, there are three things involved in this process. First, there is an activity of perceiving. Second, you need to use your sense organs to perceive. That is to say, you have to use your eyeballs. Third, there are objects perceived in perception, namely the tomatoes. A theory of perception has to give an account for these three components in perception. Therefore, Aristotle's theory answers the three questions correspondingly. The first question for Aristotle's theory of perception is, what is perception? For example, what is it for you to perceive a red tomato? The second question is, what happens to sense organs in perception? For instance, when you are seeing a red tomato, what is going on in your eyeballs? The third question is, what are the objects of perception? For instance, when you see a red tomato, what exactly are the objects that are being perceived? I have introduced the three questions for Aristotle's theory of perception. Now, let's see how Aristotle answers them. Aristotle's theory of perception has to answer the first question, what is perception? For Aristotle, perception is the kind of change from first actuality to second actuality, in which potentiality is preserved. Here is an analogy to explain this. Perception is like the kind of change from someone who has the knowledge of grammar but not using it, to someone who is actually using his grammar. In this kind of change, potentiality is preserved because in actually using his grammar, his knowledge of grammar is not lost. By contrast, perception is not the kind of change from potentiality to first actuality, in which potentiality is lost in change. Let me give you an analogy. Perception is not like the kind of change from someone who does not know grammar to someone who knows grammar. In this kind of change, potentiality is lost because once someone has learned grammar, he has lost his ignorance of grammar. The second question for Aristotle is, in perception, what happens to a sense organ? According to Aristotle, in perception, a sense organ becomes like the object of perception and receives form without matter. First, a sense organ is potentially like the object of perception before perception. When it's being acted upon in perception, the sense organ becomes like the object. For example, when you are seeing a red tomato, your sense organ, namely your eyeballs, becomes red, just like the tomato. Second, a sense organ in perception receives form without matter, just like a piece of wax can receive the imprint of a gold ring without receiving the gold of the ring. For example, when you are seeing a red tomato, your eyeballs receive the form of the tomato without receiving its matter. The third question for Aristotle is, what are the objects perceived in perception? Aristotle draws two distinctions between different kinds of objects of perception. The first distinction is a distinction between objects perceived accidentally and objects perceived by themselves. Within objects perceived by themselves, there's a second distinction between special objects and the common objects of perception. Objects perceived by themselves are those objects perceived because what they are. By comparison, objects perceived accidentally are perceived in virtue of their accidental relations with objects perceived by themselves. For example, when you see Socrates, Socrates is an accidental object of perception. This is because in vision, you do not see Socrates because he is Socrates. You see Socrates because he has certain color and shape, and that color and shaped thing is only accidentally Socrates. Therefore, Socrates is an object perceived accidentally, while color and shape are objects perceived by themselves. Within objects perceived by themselves, there's a distinction between special objects and the common objects. Special objects are those objects that can be perceived by one sense only, while common objects are objects which can be perceived by several senses. For example, color is a special object of perception because color can be perceived only by vision. By contrast, movement is a common object because movement can be perceived both by vision as well as hearing. Therefore, movement is a common object. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoy Aristotle's theory of perception, even though it's very weird.